So this will be the introductory lecture for the Western intellectual tradition, going from Plato to Erasmus of the 16th century, or the Greek tradition itself, which is of course bigger than Plato or Aristotle. And I'll be looking in the lectures at the Greek tradition, the Roman, how the Christian tradition synthesized this. And then we'll end in the 16th century with the clash between Erasmus and Luther and the impact of that on Western civilization itself. Two paths were taken. A book by Michael Massing called Fatal Discord, how Erasmus is more ironical and dovish tradition, more dialogical tradition, leads in one direction. Luther's more confrontational perspective and approach to difficulty leads to another. We can see in many ways the culture wars of today is just a secularized form of Lutheranism, is that one group is right, the other is wrong. One is oppressed, the other is the oppressor. One is the remnant of truth, the other is the bully. And life is divided into simple black and white categories. And this is the Lutheran tradition. What's secularized brings us right into the heated culture wars today, in which there tends to be more heat than light, versus the Erasmus tradition, which is always trying to find the nuanced truths in all traditions and how human nature itself being flawed, whether oppressed or oppressor, there's a deeper element of human nature that will use even the good. Vice will always use the language of virtue to further its cause, and Erasmus was acutely aware of this. And so very important to understand what occurs between Erasmus and Luther. Now, one of the dilemmas we face, which is probably the overwhelming issue most students and most people of our culture face, is just the sheer illness of memoricide, no memory. And so most people today are essentially culturally illiterate. And when a person has no sense of memory, of history, then they essentially will believe anything they're told. Noam Chomsky's famous saying that memory is a form of intellectual self-defense. And so people are very vulnerable culturally, intellectually in our time, because there is no memory, no past to think from, whether it's the Christian tradition, the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition. Even when people do turn to that, it's usually very selective in how they interpret it. So the great tradition of the West is it's either not known at all, or it's demeaned, or it's caricatured, it's distorted, and this comes largely from two movements within the West. The Protestant Reformation, which tended to, elements of the 16th century, and then those who followed even more so, tended to return to the Bible, and the great tradition which flowed from it and how you interpret the text itself was largely forgotten. So the Protestant Reformation played a significant role in undermining 1,500 years of intellectual, political, religious, philosophical, theological, literary, artistic history. And then the whole Enlightenment project, with its notion of Hegelian ever moving forward in history, continued the Protestant project. And most people today are the heirs of that dialectical progressive notion of history, in which the past, yes, it was there, but they're not as enlightened as we are today. And so this combination of Protestant sola scriptura, tradition is the problem, Bible is the answer, and then of course the Enlightenment basically said Christianity is the problem and some form of rational thinking is the answer. They conspire together, they breathe together in that sense. The Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, interesting enough, they're odd partners, and yet they share together in the process of creating memoricide, or cultural illiteracy. And so, of course, in Western intellectual tradition, going from Plato up to Erasmus, again, we don't study these as interesting figures in the past that have no relevance for us, but in fact some of their thinking on key issues of justice. So what is justice? What are the distortion of justice? How can justice be abused in the name of doing the good, but in fact it is vice that is using the language of justice to serve unjust ends? Or peace, what does it mean to be makers of peace? How did Plato, how did the Jews, how did Christians, how did the Romans, how did the Celts, how did the patristic era, how did the Middle Ages think about these issues? So we don't turn to the past as a museum culture or sort of intellectual archaeological work that is totally irrelevant for us today. We'll be shuttling back and forth between past and present to say, what role do the elders of the past, as Stephen Leacock would say, though dead yet live, have to contribute to our discussions of today? For example, here we are at university taking classes. What is our understanding of education today? How do universities define themselves? Well, to a greater or lesser degree, universities are businesses. They exist to train people with technical skills. You want to become a nurse, you want to become a pilot, you want to become a plumber, you want to become an electrician. These are technical skills. Become a lawyer, wants to become a dentist. These are, people get training at university for these skills. They come to internalize, master the skill. They then can sell themselves in the marketplace of ideas and jobs because they have a technical skill. But does that mean a person is educated? Of course not. That just means they have a technical skill. The Greek tradition of paideia and techne held together the importance of being educated, and educated in a double sense. The education in terms of being grounded in humanities. And this is why we study the great works of art and literature and music and philosophy and theology, economics and politics and social issues, and how women and men of the past have thought about it, because it will inform, it raises up our own understanding. So in conversation, we're just not babbling out silly opinions in which there's no depth of thinking. And this is why we read great works of literature, because it raises up our ability to think more meaningfully about issues rather than just sort of grunting out opinions which have not been thought through in any meaningful way. And so the study of the Western tradition from classical thought, and of course the Jewish tradition of writing in a substantive way is earlier than the Greeks, and one of the great political manifestos of the Jewish tradition is Deuteronomy, and it's a very complex and layered work that deals with combination of a prophetic understanding of justice and peace, that deals with animals, it deals with the foreigner, the outsider, but there's also a nationalist bent in it too. So what's the relationship between ethnic nationalism, as one finds in Deuteronomy, but also a more of a cosmopolitan outlook, or that human nature is more worthy of studying than ethnic groups itself? And what's the relationship, and where does a person tilt in certain directions when ethnicity raises its hand high, but in the process one ethnic group can be quite nasty towards another ethnic group, as we see particularly in Israel today. The Jewish state and Zionism in regard to the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza, East Jerusalem, the many refugee camps. And so when we look at, for example, the Jewish tradition in its historic sense, and then we fast forward that to contemporary issues of Israel, Palestinians, Middle East, and how these books are mined, particularly religious Jews, and even I might argue certain secular Jews will give a nod to these traditions. These older myths, these older stories live on, and this is why if we don't understand them, and a lot of people with degrees in political science, sadly so, are not very rooted and grounded in classical religious backgrounds, and so they are inept and inadequate in some ways in understanding why things go on the way they do, because of the secular prejudices which have so come to dominate much of the academy, that the sacred is banished in that sense. And then when one brings the secular model to interpreting political events without understanding the sacred roots, then there's a lack of understanding in terms of why things are occurring or how people are interpreting events in terms of the ultimate and the relationship to the penultimate. And so when we think of education then, is education just getting trained in a technical skill, or is it about being grounded in the humanities and paideia? Education also in the Latin sense, educare, means to draw out the best within a person's journey at any given time as they understand themselves, and what's the relationship to that, to civility, to citizenship. And if a person is only trained in technical skills without asking the question, so do I just get these skills to make money so I can build my barns bigger and amuse myself to death, or what T.S. Eliot would say, going from one distraction to another distraction? Is that all that it means to be human? Or to be human is to me to think about meaningful issues in a wise and a just and a peaceful way. We study the great works of literature and women and men of the past because they thought these things, and they can contribute in a meaningful discussion in terms of our situation that we face today, where there's the what Arnold called ignorant armies clash by night. People freeze in their interpretations of issues. They simplify, they slip into cliches, simplistic ways of looking at injustices that don't in any meaningful sense cut to the depths or bore deeper into what issues can be. And this is why we study the great works of Jewish literature and Greek literature and Roman literature and Christian literature, Celtic literature, in that sense, because it can bring a wisdom and a depth to us that without it we tend to skim across the surface of life like a stone skimming across the surface of the water. And so as we move through this course, we'll look at some and how because there's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon would say. And so the great themes of wisdom and insight versus knowledge, power and powerlessness, crime and punishment, war and peace, these are all themes that have existed throughout history, and we live with them today. And so the reflecting or the heeding or the hearing of great works of literature and art and philosophy and theology and economics assist us in a more thoughtful way in grappling with how we make sense of yet another scene in the act of the human draw. Shakespeare would say all the world's a stage and men and women merely players. We have our entrances and we have our exits, and people sometimes can become somewhat in one sense, as they look at the culture wars and the confrontations that are before us, if this is something new, or the toxicity in our culture, as if somehow this is new. There's nothing new about it. It's just another scene in an act in the play of the human drama itself. And so the more a person is grounded in history and intellectual history, we can say, okay, been there, done that. How is that worked through? How is that thought through? What's a more dialogical way, a more ironical way of dealing with these conflicts, these tensions, rather than a confrontational way like rams in rutting season? And so the study of this first part, this is really a two-part course. The first part goes from classical thought, Jewish, Greek, Roman, Christianity, as it brought together the best of all these traditions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the coming to be of the Protestant form of Christianity, you get the birth of liberalism. And this is why we will end with Erasmus and Luther, because there's two different. With Erasmus, you get the movement increasingly towards international law, standards that transcend states. With Luther, you get the rise of nationalism and a confrontational approach to handling conflictual issues, in which neither side hears in a meaningful way, and then the rise of various forms of tribalism, intellectual tribalism, social tribalism, ethnic tribalism, and the consequences for that, and the harm and hurt and the tragedy that happens to one and all. We'll also explore within the great Greek tradition, just not the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. We want to look at the way they grappled with things like, say, tragedy and comedy. Comedy not as laughter and joke, but in fact, we often look at certain forms of literature in which there's always a happy ending. So some of the great epic works of literature which people have been interested in the 20th century, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, they're all comedic in the sense there is the struggle, what the Greeks called the Agon. Everyone eventually in their journey is going to have to face challenges. They either capitulate to those challenges, they're too difficult to overcome, and they shrink as human beings. The great heroes of literature inevitably face one agon or struggle after another, both internally and externally. Comedic literature, though, ends with they overcome and there's a happy ending. So, Lord of the Rings, Mordor is destroyed, hobbits return to the Shire, Harry Potter, Voldemort is destroyed. It's a happy ending. So you get this is comedic. Now, in Greek thought, they realized, yes, that is one way of looking at life, but you also have men and women of great character, some who have examined their own tragic flaws, lead to tragedy. Some, it's not necessarily even a tragic flaw. So the great works of tragedy from Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and these people is that you can have noble women and men, but things don't work out. The ending is not happy. It's tragic. And so they reflected on this, and there's a human tendency, certainly in affluent society like the West, to think of things should always work out, and they should work out fairly quickly. And there's a fix to all human dilemmas, when in fact, within the Greek tradition, their notion of the tragic was also there's sadness, there's unpredictabilities that come our way. There's illnesses, there's deaths, there's war, there's children who are hurt and harmed, there's violence, and often the innocent suffer. And there is this tragic dilemma of life, or absurd, as they would call it, that can't easily fit into a comedic understanding of. So this tension between the tragic and the comedic is something that is important to understand. And the Greeks thought through this at a pretty sophisticated level. The great literary writers, as I mentioned earlier, the tragedians and Aristophanes with the comedic. And so these themes of the human journey are important to understand, whether from the Jewish tradition, the Greek tradition, how does one live, as say an Augustine grapples with, on the one hand, how does one hold together a pacifist position with tribes coming in and killing people, as Bishop of Hippo, large significant elements of northern Africa. At what point do you have to use violence to prevent lesser violence? And so Augustine grapples with the pacifist position, but the just war position. Under what conditions is violence or force legitimate to use? These are perennial questions that stay with us. So things like education, paideia, technique, tragic, comic, just war, pacifism. The women and men of the past have thought substantively about these issues. So this course will reflect on some of those issues, the relevance for us today, particularly skewed views of life and how we make sense of conflict and tension, and people divide too quickly and easily on simplistic interpretations. And are there more layered and meaningful ways? What can the classical Jewish, Greek, Roman, Christian tradition reflect back to us in that sense? Ways of not taking the Kool-Aid in a fairly simplistic way, and then sadly so being an agent of the problem rather than being an agent of overcoming some of the difficulties we live in. So this course, hopefully by the time we come to the end of it, at least some more moderate, sane and sensible approaches will be offered through heeding the wisdom of the past, and then what that means for us in the present time.